Welcome. So we'll have a panel session discussion. It's really a free-form discussion, and certainly take questions from the audience related to anything regarding John Ford and Francis Ford, or the film Clementine you've just seen. Right after the panel session, Scout Tafoya will do basically an introduction to the documentary Taking, which deals with Monument Valley, which you saw gloriously illustrated in the previous film. So I'll keep this because of time, very quick introductions, and you know most of these people. John Cavallero did an excellent introduction to My Darling Clementine, a professor at Bates College who teaches film studies and other topics. I'd like to reintroduce Kathy Fuller-Seeley from the University of Texas at Austin, who's our Francis Ford expert, and Gerald Perry, who's taught at Suffolk University as well as Boston University, and was in charge of the BU Cinematheque series and edited John Ford, volume of John Ford interviews. And last but not least, Scout Tafoya, who has a recent book available just outside on all of John Ford's films, And God Made Him a Poet. And Scout's also the, I think it's the longest running video essay series.
That's what I tell people, yeah.
He writes for the series The Unloved column for ebert.com on films that need to be reappreciated, which is very important. Also has a book out on the director Toby Hooper, and I'll turn it over to them. I'm going to turn this over to Gerald Perry, who's been in this position many times.
Yep. Testing? No. There's a switch. Switch.
Yeah. It says on.
It'll be like 2 seconds. Testing? No.
Testing. Hi. Yeah. Oh, one last thing, Kevin. Also, there's merch outside if you want to help this festival. It's a very expensive festival. It's brought people from all around the country. I know you paid some, but pay a little more, and be sure to get at least a T-shirt from the festival and other things. I think there's one copy of Scout's book still out there. I don't know, Kevin, is your book still available? No, it's gone. So anyway, there are a few items you can buy before you leave. So buy. So this is going to be a little schizophrenic because we're going to try to cover a bunch of things, and including, I think, Kevin, it's really important that we would love to hear not only your questions, but if you have some great theory of John Ford which never got explored all weekend, we'd love to hear what you have to say, because the thing about John Ford, there's so many things to talk about his movies, and like I can say in the last couple of days, oh my gosh, I just discovered something on a Ford film I'd never thought about before. So if you have some stuff to say, please, I think we'll really be curious to hear what he said. So I said this is a little schizophrenic. We have a couple of different agendas. I think we want to talk some about My Darling Clementine, which we just saw, and off of John's superb explanation of the movie. I have a couple of things I'd like to talk about. Kathy, as we know, is the world's expert on, among other things, Francis Ford, and we want to bring Francis Ford away from the silent era and talk about Francis Ford that we see in the movies. I don't know if you know which one is Francis Ford, but he's the mute, the silent guy who played the drums in, what's the movie you saw in Wagon Master, and is back here playing the fiddle in one scene, and also has several extraordinary moments. I was just saying that great, I think, tribute of his brother to him. You can comment on that when that "Good Night, Sweet Prince," when he is embraced by the actor leading, and I think that's saying "I love you" to Francis Ford. It's great. So we'll talk about him, and then we're going to start though with Scout, the person you haven't seen on stage before. So I think over the weekend we're sprinkling in more and more Ford experts. And so we have the last, and I'm happy to say, a younger generation of Ford experts. People like me, who are, in my autumnal or even my December years, I want to know that there are Ford people around after I, go wherever I'm going to go. And so I'm thrilled with Scout DeFoy. I reviewed his book, so he has a great book, and he has done something which only a couple of people ever have done, seen every single John Ford film in order to write it. The history of these big Ford books. In 1986, there is something forgetting. Tag Gallagher wrote the first incredible tome on John Ford. It's a thick book, and 14 years later, Joe McBride wrote his great book on John Ford. Again, thick book, and now 23 years later, Scout did something different, a very slim volume in which he covers, again, every single book, and I think in very different ways. So I told Scout, I'm going to ask this first question, and this is, why do we need another John Ford book?
Well, because, I mean, as we've sort of witnessed, and you know, as the subject of the thing is, Ford is the quintessential American filmmaker. He's somebody who embodies all of the many, at times, quite painful contradictions of progress in America. You know, that's John's beautiful opening about the success of civilization over the land, you know, the creation of things out of the frontier. But in order to do that, it means you have to displace what was there beforehand. And, you know, Ford's very complicated relationship to communities of Native Americans, specifically the ones who lived at Monument Valley, who he was always friendly with and always paid very well to use their land and use them as extras. And, you know, so he was funneling money into the land, but then he was making movies where they were villainous. I mean, as you got into a little bit yesterday, talking about Sergeant Rutledge, it's a movie where, to prove your, you know, true blue Americanism, you need to go out there and hunt the bloodthirsty native in the darkness. And, you know, we saw just a couple of minutes ago the opening of Myra Clementine finds Henry Fonda kicking a drunk Indian out of town because, you know, what kind of town is this? Only a few exceptions, like you said, Cheyenne Autumn, you know, and so that becomes the text of his entire life, as you said before, trying to figure out who this man is. And I think that I was spurred a little bit by how much of modern film discourse turns into a kind of a toothless political debate, where you're putting films in competition to see which one has the best politics, because that's the only way that a lot of people interact with their own political lives, is through the art that they consume, as if that would sort of do the work for them rather than taking part in more direct action, because I think a lot of people feel helpless, and also because it's exhausting to be alive right now. When my dear friend Willow McClay, a fantastic writer, reached out to me sometime in the middle of 2021 and asked if I had ever written about Ford, I kind of realized what a terrible oversight it was, because at that point I'd only written about 100 words on Ford's airmail for Brooklyn Magazine back when I was playing part of the great Dave Cares Restoration Festival in MoMA. So I realized there was a lot of work to be done, and also knowing that people like Joe and Tag and every other great writer from Andrew Saris to Stanley Kaufman have written these incredible, you know, monolithic pieces that informed so much of the public's understanding of Ford's work, that jumping into that thing at the vantage point of, you know, this late into the 21st century is very daunting. So I tried to approach it more like I was writing a book of poems than trying to give the definitive scholarship or anything, because I was never going to get the facts more right than Joe or Tag, and I was never going to sort of redefine them for other people. So I just kind of had to approach it in such a way that it made sense to me, and it was something that I didn't feel embarrassed to go back and reread.
And yeah, I think you should, and I say everybody has their favorite Ford films and non-favorites, and I think one of the many things I love about your book, you are very courageous about going against your canon and just whatever movie you really liked, you said you really liked, and when some of the big movies, they didn't work for you.
Yeah.
And so there was some real surprises with the ones you came up with.
I think me and John Ford are the only people who like the movie The Fugitive.
And one more.
It's my buddy Chris right there. He drove from Wisconsin to be here, so I think he wins the prize for traveling the longest distance to be here.
And you're wrong to like The Fugitive. You came all the way from Wisconsin, but it's a bad movie.
It's good movie. Good photography.
You're wrong, you're wrong, Tim.
But anyway, but again, you know, choosing among those things and the excitement of seeing how much and how little a lot of these movies have in common, where part of the reason that, you know, The Fugitive, I think, speaks to me is because it has this extreme atmospheric quality to it, which is also present in this, but it's, you know, it's a movie that also lays bare the failings of John Ford's political thought process. There, you know, he sort of fundamentally misunderstands the Cristero Wars to present Henry Fonda once more as this martyr figure. You know, he's very deliberately Christ-like in a lot of Ford films. I mean, you know, the great posture here where he's always like a hair's breadth from being crucified in a lot of Ford's images of Fonda. But then another movie that I really enjoyed that doesn't have much in the way of reputation is A Hurricane from 1937. Which is another movie that really, really gets into the sort of impossibility of appreciating a landscape while also, you know, knowing that the people who were there to understand this are colonizers, that this was a beautiful place before other people got through with it. Ford's very, very open about that in The Hurricane in a way that he isn't always, that, you know, something untouched and magnificent could only, you know, stay that way if people, you know, like white Americans stay out of it, or Europeans generally. And, you know, part of trying to make movies about it is almost sort of beside the point of appreciating it to begin with, where if you were just making landscape studies, nobody would come out to see it, and so you have to make narratives, and narratives demand heroes and villains. And that explains a lot of why Ford's later movies, attempting to get at something a little more progressive, often fall short of the mark, because there's always got to be somebody that you root for and you root against. You know, the comedies and the comedic stuff in Ford's films was not appreciated, as Joe pointed out in his opening lecture, and so he didn't always allow the movies to be that. You know, his one, I mean, maybe not his one, but the sort of like last of the modern comedies that didn't have much more of an axe to grind is Tobacco Road, which was based on a huge Broadway success, but people loathed that movie, and I don't think that escaped Ford's notice. And so, just again, you know, diving into that stuff is the fun of being a critic. It's you know, it's why it's always rewarding, even if, you know, you can't afford to pay rent.
And I think the last thing, I think one of the things that came out in your book was bringing back the 1930s, John Ford's, the Expressionist Fords, and for some reason, many film critics have denigrated that period in order to like later Ford. They don't like the Informer, which is where John Ford became really, really world famous. It's a great movie, but nobody will talk about it anymore. That's like if you like Informer, you're Dick Class A. You have to go to, you know, later films. So I think I really like that in your book that you did this. And I can say from you, you got me as a kind of, you know, left-wing Ford fan. I appreciated a perspective in your book that you did not shy away from issues of race and how Native Americans are treated. And I have to say, sometimes Ford people put their head in the sand in terms of what I guess I see, this is me, as very embarrassing racism in some of the Ford movies. And so The Sunshine Sprite is a movie which I loathe and which is adored by most advanced, and I can see Kevin shaking his head back there. What can I say? Anyway, it's all opinions finally, educated opinions, but very, very interesting. So, you want to say yes?
I was actually going to have a question. In going back through Francis's movies, you know, you talk about how he taught everything that John, you know, he taught John everything he knows, and you can see that certainly in that great the Telegrapher movie, all the incredible composition work and the, you know, use of the Z-axis and, you know, every far corner of the frame. That very much becomes a part of John Ford's, you know, methodology. Did you notice anything about Francis's politics, I guess? You know, like what, you know, do you think he had the same sort of contradictions in his movies, or do you think he was just sort of making what the people demanded?
Yes and no, both and neither. Here is a case where we don't have the films.
Mm-hmm.
And just as you say, in watching the Ford films, you can read a 200-word synopsis, But then when you see the thing and you know that there are touches of comedy or touches of characterization that are not captured by the synopsis. So I don't find it easy to say about that. I think the characteristics of loyalty to family, to believing in the worth of the individual, but the power of the group are important to him. It's hard to make, as I said, too many other generalizations when he didn't write very much,
Sure.
and the films aren't there. But Francis Ford was making different kinds of films. He didn't get to make too many more westerns.
Right.
He didn't get to make too, and so it's interesting and still a work in progress. But as I said, there are things such as the use of a stock company.
Mhm.
I was really, I really noticed having watched the films, in this series, how oftentimes the stock company characters show up.
Oh, sure.
And so what it must have been like for you to watch all the John Ford
Yeah.
films, and to see J. Farrell McDonald show up in 30 of them, as well as Francis Ford makes appearances in 30 of these talking films. And one can try and piece together the character of Brother Feeney, or one can see them as sort of little random things. There are connections between them, but like I said, I was struck in watching this about John Ford's loyalty to performers who he knew could create the kinds of characters he wanted to have.
Do you want to, I'm sorry, just while you have the, could you just talk about, while we're on Francis Ford, and later for the question I asked before, how do you situate Francis Ford? Is he just one of those guys, or is it some kind of aura around him? This is my brother, or is he nice to his brother, or not nice? You were saying, what do you think?
He and it's not just John Ford himself, it's the cameraman, it's the costumers, it's Francis Ford performing. And I have seen this in non-Ford films that he's in. He was a master in the way some other silent actors were at calling subtle attention to them. He knew the way to place himself in the scene. He knew the way to use his hands, his body, his face. Indeed, he loved to do his scenes without dialogue. When handed scenes with dialogue in John Ford and other films, he would often say, but I could do it so much better without words. So I'm just sort of learning to appreciate that art of silent film, of silent performance and character making that Francis Ford was able to bring to all these films. So yes, I think all these films take a little bit of care to point out Francis, but then I'm a little confused because I'm looking for him. But you could say the same way with Jane Darwell, when she showed up in all of these movies, whether she's blowing a Mormon horn or what. I think that's part of the sentimental in a good way, a family association that John Ford felt for his character actors, that he could use them in ways, I find, that highlight their individual abilities.
I think that's going through them all, especially in chronological order, just to keep.
Is that what you did?
Oh yeah. It allows you to sort of form a picture that you can kind of keep in your mind all the way through, and it ultimately doesn't really last because as the movies progress, you sort of forget everything that's come beforehand because the thing in front of you is so present and alive and beautiful. But a part of the sort of like beautiful treachery of these films is when you grow to love people like Ward Bond and John Wayne through their performances. And Jerry, you were talking yesterday about how much you loathe the idea of him talking down to and belittling his actors. The only trouble is it clearly worked because they're giving their best performances in these movies. Where John Wayne, when left to his own devices or directed by worse directors, he's just nowhere near as good. He really needed people who understood him as an actor, and that's the thing, is that in belittling him and in truly making his life a living hell, he made John Wayne into the incredibly moving screen presence that he can be. And that also becomes more complicated with every single thing you learn about John Wayne and what an utter terrible person he ended his life as. was you love him so much. I mean, it's, you know, Jean-Luc Godard talked about that when The Searchers was in release in France. Is, you know, how can I hate John Wayne when, you know, he opens his mouth to talk about politics and love him so much when he takes Natalie Wood into his arms in The Searchers. And that was just true of all of these people, is that you feel why John Ford loves them so much, even as he is so outwardly nasty to them, and it makes you love them and forget for a moment what truly terrible people they could be in many cases.
Yeah, I think I guess I don't really care that much if he belittled his superstars, but I know that he also was,
Well, he was
be
terrible
really
to
mean
Woody
to
Strode, yeah.
Woody Strode, and really mean to some of the people with small parts, Harry Carey Jr.'s, and so I stand by what I said. I have this very idealistic thing, which is kind of ridiculous, but I like to think that artists can be nice people. Can they be nice people? I hope they can be. That you don't have to be a rotter in order to make great art. I don't know. It's an unanswerable. What do
One
you,
of the
John?
things that
What do
might
you?
be interesting to think about, though, is, and you guys are getting at this, is how and why we forgive somebody that we know is nasty, somebody we don't agree with, or a film that, I mean, yesterday he said, I thought it was really interesting, he said, my favorite film is The Searchers. And those scenes with look I absolutely hate.
Them.
And I'm like, but it's still your favorite film, right? And so how do you forgive something that you find to be so offensive? It's an infinitely interesting question. I think we asked everybody in the room, they all have a different answer to that. And that's
Well,
kind
I
of
don't
the-
forgive the parts of The Searchers that I find loathsome. I can't just apologize for them and say, well, look at the rest of the movie. I think it's important to stop and look at that extraordinarily racist, sexist part about Luke and The Searchers and sit with it and feel really bad about it, and then go on to the rest of it. But it can't. For me, it can't be skipped over. That's the kind of.
I don't mean that you're skipping over, but,
Yeah.
but the fact that you can have a scene like that and still say that's my favorite film.
I'm contradicting.
I mean, the rest of it must be really, really good, right?
It's very good.
Yeah, it is, it is.
Okay, can we talk a second about, I'm going to switch to My Darling Clementine, and take off from what you said. So this is, I guess, you know, My Darling Clementine looks for most people like, okay, this is not a controversial film at all. You said, you know, good and evil, and we root for the good guys and whatever, but like what Scott was beginning to bring up is, of course, and this is what we often do. We'll ruin a film by looking at it politically.
It's our job.
It's our job, I guess. And so I would say rather than good and evil of this film, to me, is like Puritanism and order versus chaos and anarchy. And this is what hit me this time watching the movie. I didn't realize the Wyatt Earp character is such a Puritan, and that's not what we think of John Ford, right? He's a guy who always hates Puritanism and sets up the Puritans are the bad people, and the people filled with life and vigor and charm, and they're the good guy. But he is really, in a way, a real stick in the mud in every way. And like when you see him kissing on the cheek, Clementine, that's it for their. He did not sleep with Clementine. That's as far as he went. So he is.
And that was the part that Zanuck changed.
And that was made
He was supposed to just shake
It was
his hand.
just supposed to be a shake of a hand. Yeah. By the way, I'm defending Daryl Zanuck, who, as we heard, interfered with the movie and took out a half an hour. Maybe it's a great half hour, but I don't want another half hour of that movie. That's enough. And with the two scenes, it's really strange. One of the two scenes that he inserted in the movie were the one, and this is very strange, the scene in which Wyatt Earp talks to the grave of his brother, and that's the most Fordian scene. Ford does that in so many movies, and yet he didn't shoot that scene. And the last scene
You
is
can
not.
tell too, because Monument Valley is a painted backdrop.
It's a painted background,
It's
yeah.
not real.
But it's a simulated Ford scene, like AI today. Did Ford do it? I don't know. And then the ending scene, which is, John just said, is supposed to be a handshake and no kiss. And I guess, so he didn't shoot that last scene either? Did Ford shoot the last scene, or is that, I don't know.
I think he shot all of them with the kiss. Like the kiss is a own shot.
Oh, but the.
You can kind of tell,
Yeah.
that's the character,
Yeah.
the sky changes behind.
Oh, the sky chases.
Yeah.
And Darryl Zanuck's also the person who did the last scene of Grapes of Wrath, which is Ford isn't even around for. We're the people, we go on, the great ending, political ending, that's, Ford wasn't around for it. So Darryl Zanuck's another, back to your question, incredible son of a bitch. Horrible womanizer, power monger, everything else, but
Kind of Harvey Weinstein.
kind of a Harvey Weinstein
Very much.
before that. But, you know.
Did I read somewhere that he killed somebody on a hunting party one time and they hushed that up?
Sure.
Just keep it quiet. Yeah, so anyway, so back to My Darling Clementine. So this is kind of a darker political reading. There's this, I forgot to reread Frederick Jackson Turner's famous essay in the 1890s about people moving west, and it's a very white man's version in which white men keep moving west, civilizing places and going further west, and that's this great celebration of American democracy. And that, of course, leaves out, as Scott immediately said, wait a second, that means kicking Indians out of the way. And so what you have here is a white man story. This town is cleaned up by this Puritan, every kind of anarchy, every kind of native person is kicked out. The only people, this is interesting, this is what I noticed today, the only okay people from another culture are the musicians. And that's always allowed. Musicians, black musicians, okay in 30s movies, just not black characters, except. So you have this, he's made this total white man, Puritan white man's town out of Tombstone and rides off to maybe do it in another town. So that's, if you look at it that way, it's kind of this yucky movie, which we don't want because we love it. But so John, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Indian scene at the beginning is awful, obviously, and it stands out. But I think we have a tendency sometimes to focus on representation of individual characters and individual groups. And one of the things that you're going to see this afternoon when you watch The Taking is this focus on the landscape as a spiritual place that is being used as a canvas for a movie made by a filmmaker. And I think that's an important part of this too. When we watch My Darling Clementine, in some ways it seems like a better representation because there aren't a lot of really offensive representations in the film. And you see some other Ford films, but what he's doing with the landscape, I think, is also worthy of comment.
So what do you think he's saying about landscape in this movie?
Well, I just think, I think the question is to what extent does a filmmaker need to be sensitive to the place that they're using and the meaning of the place that they're using when they make a film like this, right? I don't know, I mean, again, all I know is pretty much from The Taking about the spiritual meaning of Monument Valley to the Navajo people. But it's very different, and all of a sudden he's coming in and making this film there. You can imagine if it were flipped and it was like, okay, we're going to go to the Vatican and we're going to make this movie that has nothing to do with Catholicism, how people might react to that. But Ford going to the Monument Valley, taking that place and making it into this metaphor of freedom, civilization coming and whatnot, we don't really bat an eyelash at, or we haven't yet until now. With this film, and maybe some of the criticism that'll come out from it.
So you're not really contradicting what we were saying, but you're now extending it to pull the camera back and see that it's being shot in Monument Valley, and then what are the implications of the story? I think Scott and I are setting up the same story. It's even another, maybe even darker.
Well, yeah. And I'm not. I think I find it a little defensive when people are like, no, there's nothing racist about the representations that Ford offers.
Yeah.
I think that they're complicated. I think that there are racist parts to it, and there are other things that he did that were progressive.
Always.
And they exist side by side. And our job is to kind of, not to ignore half of the representation, but to then sort through the complexities that it creates.
Well, and the other thing too is that, movies in America, certainly as Ford progressed, became the dominant method of, peddling myths and the self-portrait of America, that people started going to movies with the same, frequency that they'd be opening a newspaper or reading a book, and because of the incredible ability to manipulate your audience that film could have, especially when you are as talented as somebody like John Ford, or, pick your golden age director, that the thing that wasn't really talked about by, certainly not by a lot of white critics, is we controlled the narrative of how you were meant to think about these things. And like you were saying, the meaning of a place like Monument Valley to the indigenous population, or frankly anywhere that Ford was going to go. I mean, you could talk about Donovan's Reef, or Seven Women, that, again, another movie that I love, but has a truly problematic understanding of the Chinese who are supposed to, they're basically, he's treating a country and the horrible, brutal conflict between these people as the backdrop to a crisis of faith between white characters, And again, I love that movie, but you cannot not see those things. And because we controlled that, and we did not allow Native filmmakers, Black filmmakers, and Mexican filmmakers to tell their side of the story for a very long time, that it's always funny that, the Japanese were very good at this in portraying white characters in their post-war films as these, opportunistic, very lost people, because that was what it looked like to people who had been conquered. Seijun Suzuki has a lot of great vignettes with American characters in a lot of his post-war films. And, it took a very long time for America to fully, we're still not there, frankly, but to decolonize the means of production in American cinema. There has been, in the last 10 years especially, a reckoning with the years of history that didn't get touched by artists, who were actually affected by the things that Americans were doing on a policy level. And, it was basically Ford's word to use him as a monolith in this particular analogy against everybody else's. That this was how it was meant to be. As you're saying, this puritanical, he's riding from place to place, making it whiter. And, you have to reckon with that, because that's,
I'm sorry, I'm just looking, Kevin is raising his finger, and I don't know.
Oh, we have some more time. I was just going to say, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah,
please.
Yeah.
But maybe some questions from
Yeah.
the
Oh,
audience.
sorry, yes, please.
I did want to, actually, now that I have my hand.
Yes, young man.
Invite the audience to meet
If you can hear me, Jerry's heard me say this before, but when Peter Bogdanovich once asked John Ford about one of his films, he said, well, I didn't write the goddamn thing. And this is, we don't pay enough attention to the fact that, there were screenwriters and stories that they're based on. And of course, Ford chose, up to some degree, some of his films were personal projects. Other times they were assignments. So I think sometimes as you talk about story elements and whether one film that Ford does is less racist than another, we have to see who the screenwriter is and what they were up to. Because sometimes he just took over the assignment, started filming it in a beautiful way, but the story was already there. So I just wanted to get your input on that.
Well, that's unanswerable when you try to, open up the film with all the different people. But I think I've answered to you before. I think that, when we say John Ford and that means everything, it makes more sense with Ford because he was a power person who almost always made the movie. I believe that he wanted to make that. If he didn't like a script, I don't believe he would have done a script. I think, or he would shape the script. This is again my belief, the way John Ford would want to see it, and it's not true of many directors. I think he's handed a lot more. He's handed a lot of casts, which he came into a movie, and this movie's already cast. And yet, even there, it always seems to turn into a John Ford film. So, yes, we should always consider the screenwriter, and yet I don't consider them that much with Ford movies.
Well, the story that comes to mind with that particular thing are the movies that he didn't end up finishing. When he started a few weeks' work on Pinky, the Elia Kazan film, which was sort of pitched as almost like a continuation of Kazan's first movie, Gentleman's Agreement, but instead of about Jewishness, it's about blackness and passing in that way. That was the Kazan subject for the first few years of his career. But he left the film, or was basically pushed out of the film, depends on whose version of that you read, and that was another Zanuck thing, where he apparently was kind of talking down to Ethel Waters. He didn't know how to direct her because he was treating her like any of the other members of his stock company. And she was not going to tolerate that because she had worked very hard to get where she was, and she wasn't going to play this kind of mammy character that had been so much a part of the white man's version of cinema.
Anybody else on screenwriters? John?
No.
No, okay, let's get other people. Yes, please.
Yeah, so as I watch more Ford films, I think it's interesting to consider all these elements you're talking about with the very white man's view of history, but then of course with films such as The Searchers, there's the subversive element to that. But maybe it's also critiquing that white man's view of the world in some ways. And I guess, with my going, sometimes and bring this whole, Wyatt Earp is colonizing the West as he goes from town to town. There's also this, it's possible I'm just projecting my modern view onto it, but also there's like such a clear sense of melancholy to the film, specifically the ending, like the girl watching him leave for, kind of almost as if it's like a negative thing, perhaps. And I say this not to ignore your criticism or defend the work, I guess, but I just how much do you want to how much do you think this is a commentary, or is it just portraying it as it is, I guess?
Go ahead.
I think the character of melancholy that shows up in his movies, it comes from a very poetic understanding of narrative. That I think in those cases what he's trying to do is be true to the story as it needs to be told, or at least as he understood that it needed to be told. And so I think those things can and largely do exist outside of the broader points of, let's say, the screenplay. That he understands that a movie has to end a certain way because that's what people respond to, and it's what he responded to. It's as you say, it's melancholy, and I would argue a very Irish sense of melancholy. The thing about leaving home was sort of one of the great John Ford narratives, and I think that he can be true to every moment, essentially. That this scene requires this particular treatment, this scene requires this particular thing, and it's really just sort of about what's in front of you and what's happening. That's my read.
Another question? I'm sorry.
Oh, I think you're not giving John Ford enough credit, and that's kind of funny to say, I suppose. But that somehow he was unaware of how some of these characters appeared in his films. And he's making a film about the 19th century. That's how these figures were then, and that's how they would have reacted to the Native Americans, and that's how they would have done this stuff. To try and parse it so that now we come to terms with maybe our own feelings about ourselves, good and bad, we kind of put it on John Ford. My thought, which was inspired by the talk yesterday, was about that scene which you mentioned, where Jeffrey Hunter kicks his Indian wife or girlfriend. My thought about it is that what Ford is, I'm not going to say what Ford is saying, the way that I see it, is that Jeffrey Hunter's not perfect. And the people that we want to make perfect, or that we want to identify with, that's how we should have acted back then. That's who they were then. And so just like, what's his name, John Wayne is neither good, no, he's a combination of good and bad in The Searchers. So is the much vaunted figure of Jeffrey Hunter, who's the half this and half that guy. And he's also, frankly, not perfect. And so that we place in these films, we want these characters to somehow vindicate politics or history in 2023. And I think it's naive to suggest that Ford wasn't aware of that. So that's a thought.
Well, I think I said I have 1 foot in wokeness and 1 foot outside wokeness, and when I look at films from the view of 2023, I realize first that these films were made a long time ago, and the ideology of the world was different, and I say that. And then there's a part of me that split and says, yeah, even so, I'm not an innocent person, and I live in 2023, and I can't help but be bothered by these things. And it's a total contradiction, and yet, but the other part where you say that when these things, for Ford, these things happened in the past, he is constructing what happened in the past. There is no literal, it's a personal view of the past. So when I mentioned yesterday a couple of things I hate about John Ford. Third thing I hate about John Ford is his romance of the Old South, which is in many, many movies. The idea of this kind of world in which blacks and whites get along, all the whites are in charge, and everybody is happy, and drives me crazy because and in fact that was a very common view like 20 years ago. The noble South, the great Robert E. Lee, the gentleman's gentleman, and I think the world has come around to now saying like the South did not fight for its dignity or it fought to keep racism going. It fought for slavery. It wanted to preserve slavery. And we've been shaken up, so when people have this view of the wonderful Old South, it's troublesome, but in Ford, he really believes in the beautifulness of the Old South. He really believes in it. It drives me crazy.
I would add to this discussion, and I want to hear more comments, so I'll try to keep it quick, is that I think there's two things that are going on there. One is he's imagining a certain kind of audience that he's making this film for. And if he were imagining a Native American audience or a BIPOC or whatever, it would be a different movie.
And crucially, he was the first person in that audience.
Okay. And the second thing I would say is, like, looking at it today, I think one of the things that fascinates me, and maybe all of us, and certainly my students, is not this sense of, oh, it's a 50s film and there's racism in it. It's more, we're interested in how the culture that we have now was created. And so watching these films and seeing these things helped me to understand how a white supremacist culture came to be cemented to the point that we are today. And we're trying to undo it, but the seeds of it can be spotted in a lot of these early movies.
Very much.
I think we can take one more question.
Okay, I'll say, I was just like a general comment here. We were all talking about, I think Kathy has kept out of saying the critical things, but John Ford is my favorite filmmaker. I am a contradictory person. As I'm saying all these things, he is my favorite. And we live in a world today, this is my 1 second of preachment, in which contradiction is not appreciated by 90% of the people. People want movies that verify what they already believe. That's a good movie. If it says what you believe, it's a good movie. And I am interested in being stretched, my mind stretched, and so contradictory movies really interest me. And there's nobody on earth that's more contradictory as a filmmaker than John Ford, which makes him endlessly fascinating. As I'm attacking one thing today, as I said yesterday, there's another movie which he has some politics or some view that I totally love. Contradiction is at the heart of really great art, I think. That's it. Okay.
We can take one more question.
One more question. Yes.
This is just a footnote, I guess, but my personal favorite John Ford film probably is, I think it's called Judge Coffin.
Judge Priest.
Judge Priest, his favorite film.
Which is the one that he made after he won an Oscar or something. And it's got the judge is sort of best friends with an actor, who's called.
It's Will Rogers.
Such a great movie.
It's a great movie.
Best friends. He's a best friend, but he also works for him.
But very complicated.
Very complicated relationship.
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah.
That Judge Priest, also The Sun Shines Bright, and another Ford film, Kentucky Pride, are all set in Kentucky, which is not the South. Kentucky had Mason-Dixon line running straight through it. I think that might have been part of his attraction to that. But Ford seemed to hate Southerners. One of his heroes was Sherman's March. And if you want to see a movie where Southerners are depicted in the worst way possible, just watch Tobacco Road, which is just, it's lamentable how much he hates every character.
And so contradictions.
Exactly.
That's-
And I didn't think he hated the people in Tobacco Road. I think it was not that good a movie, but I thought he kind of liked Erskine Caldwell's characters. I didn't have any problem, and I don't think he hates the South at all. He's crazy about it. I mean, playing Dixie with a bunch of people out in the streets, often black people singing Dixie, like, to me, Jewish, that's like, you know, Jews playing some Nazi thing, and that's okay. It really bothers me. And I'm saying, you know, I'm being very contradictory, so if you're feeling uncomfortable and hate me, I understand.
I have to add just real quick, I'm sorry, but the person who turned me on to John Ford, the reason I'm here is Stanley Crouch.
Yeah.
Who's an African-American crazy. Really, I just wish he was here to explain from a very progressive, a very complicated African-American perspective why he loves all those films and why and what he saw in it. So I'm just saying, in his memory, we should all read Stanley Crouch on race and Ford, because I think he would liven it up. I'm sorry.
Wish Danny were here, but he's not. Yes, sir.
Well, like, this is real fast. Like you say, Ford's feelings about all this stuff are very complicated and often contradictory. There's a wonderful, poignant moment in She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, where this old, overaged soldier has died. Turns out he's an ex-Confederate general, and there's this little business with stars and bars, you know, being put on his grave, so on. One of the things may have been of his perception of white Southerners as a beaten people, and in some ways like the Irish subjected to them.
Again, I'm being really mean. The Nazis were beaten. I don't want to see. No, seriously, I don't want to see a shrine to a Nazi general.
Right, the Southern white upper class was never defeated. And that's,
Never defeated.
They won the peace. That's the.
And by the way, I grew up in the South. I grew up in South Carolina, so.
I wanted to thank our panel for a really spirited discussion. And unfortunately, some of us will be around after the taking if you wanted to chat with us. And Gerald unfortunately has to leave, but he usually does so that, you know, people won't criticize him after what he said. So he has to head back to Cambridge, but a few of us will be around, but we'll have to talk to Gerald later. Thank you very much for being here. And we're going to just do like a minute reset up, and Scout's going to introduce The Taking. Fabulous recent documentary.
By the way, can we applaud the audience?
Yay.
The audience.
Thanks very much to our panelists, John and Kathy and Jerry and Scout. So we'll get reset up and we'll leave in 1 minute. Thank you.